Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Cuba is one of the largest Caribbean islands. It was discovered by Christopher Columbus on October 27, 1492, and was considered territory and soon became a colony of Spain. The Spanish diseases and hard labor killed off many of the local populations, and rebellions occurred in the 19th century, but they did not end the harsh Spanish rule. Increased tensions between the Spanish and the U.S. led to the Spanish-American War, where the Spanish finally withdrew from Cuba. In 1902, Cuba gained formal independence. The U.S. wanted to annex Cuba, but because of the Teller Amendment, they were unable to do so. Under U.S. imperialism after the Spanish-American War, Cuba turned into a neo-colony. The U.S. passed the Platt Amendment, which set conditions for Cuba's domestic affairs and was incorporated into the Constitution in 1934. During the 1950s, the U.S. controlled 80% of Cuban utilities, 90% of Cuban mines, 90% of cattle ranches, 40% of their sugar industry, and almost all of the country's oil refineries. Cuba became an investor's paradise for U.S. gamblers, real estate operators, and hotel owners. During the regime of Batista, the Cuban Revolution occurred, which was a rising up against U.S. imperialism. The U.S. lost this revolution but wanted to regain profits. In 1925, the Communist Party began its rule in Cuba. When Castro overthrew Batista in 1959, the Communist Party stopped giving support to the Cuban government, as Castro was not a communist. After the U.S. failed to overthrow Castro at the Bay of Pigs, the USSR stepped in and regained the communist roots in Cuba. The threat that the USSR and Cuban missiles provided during the crisis was enormous. Among the missiles that were found on site by the U-2 spy planes were the F-74 Divna, and in 8 different locations, surface-to-air missiles. Other missiles found on the site in Cuba were Russian-built MiG-21 fighters, which were part of NATO, and Il-28 light bombers. There were B-52 bombers that were in various locations that were ready to take off fully equipped in 15 minutes. These missiles allowed the USSR to target almost any point in the continental U.S. The U.S.'s methods of warfare in this situation was espionage. Bay of Pigs was an unsuccessful CIA attempt to overthrow Castro and invade southern Cuba. The CIA recruited, trained, and armed anti-Castro Cuban exiles to help participate in the invasion. President Kennedy approved this invasion and was supported by the U.S. government. After Castro's military won, the CIA returned home embarrassed. Some blame Kennedy for not giving the exiles enough support and for not using the U.S. Air Force. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev thought the U.S. would not be able to contain Soviet expansion in Latin America. He installed 42 missile sites in Cuba in July of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation between Cuba, the Soviet Union, and the U.S. during the Cold War. The missiles were declared a threat, and President Kennedy set up a naval blockade of Cuba and insisted Khrushchev remove the missiles. Eventually, an agreement was made. If Khrushchev removed the missiles, the U.S. would not invade Cuba. The missiles were removed, but people across the globe feared nuclear war
by Chairman
was
Khrushchev
coming.
that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days. He also agrees that these planes can be observed and counted as they leave.
There were many effects of the crisis in Cuba and with the Soviets, including the USSR increase in production of nuclear weapons as to keep up and accelerate the arms race. The Cuban leader, Castro, became very dependent on Soviet resources and information because the ties with the U.S. had been diminished or greatly decreased. Because Cuba was relying on the USSR for help, they wanted something in return, and so Castro modeled Cuban society and government after that in the USSR. This increased Castro's power and decreased the society's morale. Although President Kennedy was revered before the missile crisis, afterwards respect for him grew even more. The crisis both accelerated and slowed down the Cold War. The two superpowers installed a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin and were able to communicate very quickly this way, and in August of 1963, Washington and Moscow signed a limited test ban treaty. The Vietnam War was very unpopular among Americans, and many think that the respect and honor Kennedy received after the crisis led him to intervene more in Vietnam, causing unrest with Americans. The U.S.'s relationship with Cuba became more careful, watchful, and strict.